In the winter of 1941, Joseph Stalin began to believe that the Soviet Union might be left to die alone. As German armies advanced and Soviet losses mounted, he questioned whether Allied promises would ever turn into real action. The reality facing the Soviet Union after the German invasion was unlike anything its leadership had imagined. Operation Barbarossa had torn through the Red Army with devastating speed. Entire formations were encircled and destroyed. Millions of soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured within months. Vast territories were lost, including key agricultural and industrial regions. Cities burned, rail lines collapsed, and factories were dismantled and dragged eastward under fire. The Soviet state survived, but barely. Stalin understood that even with ruthless control and total mobilization, the Soviet Union could not absorb this level of punishment forever. Time was running out and relief had to come from outside. From the moment Germany invaded, Stalin demanded one thing above all else from Britain and later the United States: a second front in Western Europe. Without it, the Red Army would continue to face the full weight of the German military alone. Publicly, the Allies spoke of unity and shared sacrifice. Privately, Stalin saw only hesitation. British forces were tied down defending imperial interests and fighting limited campaigns far from Germany's core. The United States was still mobilizing, its army inexperienced, its command structure untested. To Stalin, this did not look like preparation for an imminent invasion. It looked like delay. This delay fed a growing suspicion. Stalin began to question whether the Allies actually wanted the Soviet Union to survive the war intact. He was well aware of Western hostility toward communism and remembered how the Soviet Union had been isolated in the years leading up to the conflict. The Munich Agreement still cast a long shadow. Stalin wondered whether Britain and the United States were content to let Germany and the Soviet Union bleed each other dry, stepping in only once both were weakened. This was not paranoia alone, it was a strategic calculation shaped by experience. Correspondence with Allied leaders grew increasingly tense. Stalin pressed for clear timelines and concrete commitments. What he received were assurances without dates. Churchill spoke of future plans and long-term strategy. Roosevelt emphasized production and preparation. None of it addressed Stalin's immediate fear. Every month without a second front meant more Soviet lives lost and more ground surrendered. Every delay strengthened Germany's position in the east. Meanwhile, the battlefield situation worsened. In 1942, German forces launched a renewed offensive aimed at the Caucasus and the city of Stalingrad. Oil supplies were threatened. Soviet logistics strained under constant attack. The Red Army fought desperately, often with minimal reserves, knowing that defeat in the south could cripple the entire war effort. Stalin watched the map shrink and calculated how long the Soviet system could endure before exhaustion set in. Lend-Lease aid began to arrive, providing trucks, food, fuel, and raw materials. These supplies were vital, but they did not solve the core problem. Material support could slow collapse, but it could not reduce German pressure on the Eastern Front. Stalin wanted German divisions pulled away. He wanted relief that only a Western invasion could provide. Without it, the Soviet Union remained trapped in a war of attrition against an enemy still capable of concentrating its forces. By late 1942, Stalin's fear hardened into a strategic assumption. He planned Soviet operations under the belief that the Red Army might have to defeat Germany largely on its own. This assumption influenced everything from risk tolerance to manpower usage. It also deepened Stalin's distrust of his allies. The alliance existed on paper, but in Stalin's mind, it remained conditional and fragile. This was the crisis that haunted Soviet leadership in silence. It was not merely a fear of betrayal, but a fear of isolation at the most dangerous moment of the war. As German forces pressed deeper and Allied action remained uncertain, Stalin faced the possibility that survival would depend not on promises, but on endurance alone. As the war dragged into 1942, Stalin's suspicion hardened into open pressure. His messages to Churchill and Roosevelt grew sharper, less diplomatic, and increasingly accusatory. He no longer asked whether a second front would be opened. He demanded to know when. Every delay was interpreted as indifference or calculation. Stalin argued that the Soviet Union was bearing the overwhelming burden of the war, absorbing casualties on a scale the Western Allies had yet to experience. Millions of Soviet soldiers were dead or captured. Entire regions lay in ruins. And still, German divisions remained concentrated in the east. From Stalin's perspective, Allied caution was indistinguishable from abandonment. Churchill attempted to manage the situation through reassurance. He emphasized Britain's limited capacity and the dangers of a premature invasion. He pointed to ongoing operations in North Africa and the Mediterranean as evidence of commitment. To Stalin, these explanations rang hollow. Peripheral campaigns did nothing to relieve pressure on the Eastern Front. They did not force Germany to redeploy significant forces. Stalin saw them as excuses, not solutions. The deeper the Red Army bled, the less patience he had for strategic justifications. His distrust was compounded by intelligence reports suggesting that Allied leaders doubted Soviet staying power. Stalin interpreted this as confirmation of his worst fear. The Allies were hedging, waiting to see if the Soviet Union would survive before committing fully. Roosevelt's position was more complex. He sympathized with Stalin's demands but understood the limits of American readiness. The United States was still building its army, training commanders, and expanding production. A cross-channel invasion in 1942 would have risked catastrophic failure. Roosevelt tried to balance urgency with realism, promising eventual action while accelerating material support. Yet promises without immediate relief only deepened Stalin's resentment. In Stalin's calculations, time was measured in divisions destroyed and cities lost. Political explanations did not stop German tanks. This growing tension threatened the alliance itself. Mutual suspicion poisoned communication. Stalin questioned Allied intelligence sharing. He worried that critical information was being withheld. At the same time, Western leaders grew uneasy about Stalin's intentions. They feared that prolonged isolation might push him toward separate arrangements or extreme unilateral action. Trust eroded quietly beneath the surface of public declarations of unity. The alliance held, but it strained under the weight of incompatible realities. On the battlefield, the crisis intensified. The German summer offensive of 1942 drove toward the Volga and the Caucasus, placing Soviet oil supplies at risk. Stalingrad became a focal point not just militarily, but psychologically. Stalin understood that defeat there would be catastrophic. He ordered the city held at all costs, committing reserves he could scarcely afford. As the fighting escalated, Stalin's desperation grew. Every day, without Allied action, reinforced the belief that the Soviet Union was expected to sacrifice itself for a future victory that others would eventually claim. Lend-Lease shipments increased, and their impact became undeniable. American trucks improved mobility. Food shipments sustained armies and cities. Fuel kept operations moving. Yet these contributions carried a psychological cost. Stalin resented dependence. Aid without a second front felt like a substitute for commitment rather than proof of it. Supplies could be measured and counted. Political will was harder to quantify. By late 1942, the alliance stood at a critical juncture. Stalin's faith in Allied intentions was at its lowest point. He prepared for the possibility that the Red Army would have to carry the war to Berlin largely alone. This belief hardened Soviet resolve, but it also sharpened post-war thinking. Stalin began to consider how the balance of power would look after victory, assuming that wartime isolation would translate into post-war vulnerability. This phase of the war reveals how close the alliance came to internal fracture, not through open conflict, but through accumulated mistrust. The Soviet Union fought for survival while doubting whether its partners truly shared that urgency. The crisis was not visible on the battlefield, but it shaped decisions that would echo long after the war ended. The turning point came not with trust, but with necessity. By late 1942 and early 1943, Events on the battlefield began to shift the balance in ways that neither side could ignore. The Soviet victory at Stalingrad marked a decisive psychological and strategic reversal. For the first time since the German invasion, an entire Axis army had been destroyed. The Red Army demonstrated that it could not only survive but strike back decisively. This altered Allied calculations. The Soviet Union was no longer a collapsing front that needed to be managed cautiously. It was becoming a force that would shape the post-war balance of power. For Roosevelt and Churchill, this reality carried urgency of its own. Delay now risked not just Soviet defeat, but Soviet dominance. At the same time, Allied readiness finally approached the threshold Stalin had demanded for years. American production surged, troop levels expanded, amphibious doctrine matured. The catastrophic risks of a premature invasion diminished, though they did not disappear. The decision to open a second front was no longer theoretical. It became a question of timing and control. In 1943, at conferences in Casablanca and later Tehran, the issue was confronted directly. Stalin pressed relentlessly. He reminded his allies of every delay, every loss, every promise deferred. Roosevelt, balancing military reality and political necessity, committed to a cross-channel invasion the following year. Churchill acquiesced, though reluctantly, understanding that continued delay would fracture the alliance beyond repair. For Stalin, the commitment was vindication, but not reassurance. The promise of a second front did not erase years of suspicion. He accepted the decision pragmatically, not emotionally. The Red Army continued to plan and fight, as if it would still bear the primary burden of defeating Germany. Soviet offensives intensified. Casualties mounted. Stalin did not slow down in anticipation of relief. He accelerated. Trust, once broken, was not easily restored. When Allied forces finally landed in Normandy in June 1944, Stalin acknowledged the opening of the second front he had demanded since 1941. Yet even then, the sense of abandonment lingered. Too many Soviet lives had already been lost, too much territory had been destroyed. In Stalin's view, the delay had shaped the entire war. The Soviet Union had paid the price of Allied caution, and that debt would not be forgotten. This experience hardened Stalin's worldview. The alliance had worked, but only under extreme pressure and mutual suspicion. Cooperation had been forced, not natural. The belief that the West would always act in its own interest, even at the expense of allies, became a cornerstone of Soviet post-war strategy. Wartime distrust flowed seamlessly into Cold War paranoia. The crisis Stalin feared did not end with victory. It transformed into doctrine. The broader lesson of this episode lies in how alliances function under existential strain. Shared enemies do not guarantee shared urgency. Each nation calculates risk differently based on its own capacity, geography, and political constraints. For the Soviet Union, delay meant annihilation. For Britain and the United States, delay meant survival until readiness. These perspectives were never fully reconciled. They were managed, barely, long enough to defeat a common enemy. This crisis is rarely remembered because it produced no open rupture. The alliance held. Victory followed. But beneath the surface, the damage was lasting. Stalin's fear that the Allies might abandon him was never entirely disproven. It was merely overtaken by events. The Red Army reached Berlin not because trust prevailed, but because endurance did. World War II is often remembered as a triumph of unity. The reality was more fragile. The alliance survived not because suspicion disappeared, but because catastrophe demanded cooperation. Stalin's crisis reveals how close that cooperation came to unraveling, and how deeply its scars shaped the world that followed.